Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing.
All right. The phrase is time, times, and half a time. I'm just going to open up the floor and let somebody in the audience who is smarter than me explain what that is so we can call this class over for the day. I don't see any hands going up yet. Just throw your hand up and I will call on you and you can tell us what you know and we can be done. Okay, I guess it's stuck with me. So let's talk about this. This is the single most controversial phrase in this book. And the reason why this phrase stands above the rest is worth noting. There are other controversial phrases. We've talked about some of them as we've gone along. Why is this one so controverted? Well, it's generated more debate than any other wording for basically 4 reasons. Number one, its meaning is completely undefined in the text. Daniel never explains what time is. And because it never explains what time is, there's not really any way of understanding exactly how the phrase should be measured. Is time a minute? Is it an hour? Is it a day? Is it a week? Is it a year? Is it a lifetime? What exactly is it? That is part of the debate. Secondly, it sits in the center of Daniel's most disputed visions. And so you look at the visions in this book, and the ones that are of greatest controversy, the visions as a whole that are of greatest controversy, kind of hinge on this statement. So it's tied to persecution of the saints, which is a big theme of the book. It's tied to divine limitation of evil, which is a big theme of this book. It's tied to the resolution of history, which is a big theme of this book. So if you got this phrase that we're not sure exactly what means, or at least we dispute exactly what it means, maybe that's the better way to say it, because there's a lot of people who are very sure about what it means, but there are people who dispute whether that's in fact what it means. And all of the major themes of the book depend upon understanding the phrase, then you have problems. Because if you don't understand the phrase and this theme hinges on the phrase, then you don't really understand the theme. even though you might understand general concepts from it and be able to say, yeah, I know what that's talking about. You then get back to the problem of, but when? And for how long? And what exactly is this talking about? Something that's already happened? Something that is happening? Something that is yet to happen? Thirdly, it is, well, I'm gonna offer this third one with some reservation. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable saying it's reused elsewhere in Scripture. The method is reused elsewhere in Scripture. The phrase is not. But the temporal formula appears, for instance, in Revelation, where it talks about a period of months or a period, the 1260 days. Um, it's common in apocalyptic material to use temporal formulas to express things. And it's even common in apocalyptic literature to use numbers to express individuals. And there's a um, whole, again, I hate using this word, but it's the best word I can come up with. A whole science, a whole epistemology that centers around interpreting and disclosing meanings for numerology. That's what it's called, by the way, numerology. Um, as a general rule, I dismiss about 99.999% of all of it. That notwithstanding, I bring it up so that we understand that it's not uncommon to use temporal or numerical ideas to stand for something else, but it becomes very hard, absent a key, to know exactly what it stands for. And everybody in here's taken algebra at some point in their life. If you look at an algebraic expression and you have the letter A in the algebraic expression, and to be fair, let's say you have some other variable, C, but you are given no information about what A or C is. How do you figure it out? How do you determine what the answer to the value of A is? And I'm gonna tell you, you'll never get an absolute value for A. Now, if you're given all the other players and have enough information, you might be able to determine what A stands for by working through the equation. But very often when you have two unidentified variables, what you end up with is an answer that is dependent upon the other, which you equally don't know. And so when you're not given the key pieces of information to define these things, to put an absolute definition on them can be a mistake. And it never, at least, should be offered as this is absolutely what this means. So just keep that in mind. The fourth one is that it drives the interpretive framework that people bring into the book. Does anybody know what I mean by interpretive framework? Okay, that's certainly part of it. Um, to interpret things is perspective, right? That's exactly what we're telling you. The perspective that you use to make sense out of what is there. Um, Two people can look at the same thing from completely different perspectives, and they see something different. I'll just give you a really, really rough estimate that an illustration that maybe we can relate to. Let's imagine that you have somebody who has been the victim of some kind of trauma, and you have another person who has not been the victim of some kind of trauma. The trauma has been initiated on the first individual from a particular source, a father, a mother, whatever, someone of a particular ethnic background, whatever you want to make it, doesn't really matter. But there is a source for the trauma. These two individuals, one that has experienced the trauma and one that has not experienced any trauma, look at a situation in which that variable is involved. Are they going to read that situation the same way? And the answer is no. That is why people who are victims of racism respond to certain words differently than people who are not victims of racism. Those words don't mean exactly the same thing because the perspective is different. And so this person may take the literal meaning of the word, and this other person says, oh, no, there's a whole history behind that. That is what we're talking about here. When you have these paradigms, these perspectives with which you view the text, it affects the way you interpret the language. All right. There are basically four broad categories of interpreting, especially the apocalyptic text of the Bible: the historical, the futurist, the preterist, and the idealist readings. We'll talk about those in just a minute so that means something to you. But anyway, depending on which one of those you hold most closely to and hold most tightly to, that affects the way that you read what this means. And what one person looks at and says, oh, clearly this is what this means. The next person looks at it and says, no, that's not what that means. It means something completely different. The historicist is one who interprets prophetic messages as a continuous timeline of history. Beginning in the prophet's own era and unfolding progressively throughout major historical events, up to and sometimes including the end of all things. Symbols are mapped into identifiable historical moments, movements, institutions, periods. So a symbol is used, okay, this is this event in history. And if that's this event in history, then the next symbol has to be a different event in history that came when? After it. And so the historical timeline becomes the basis in which you are defining the symbolic language. The futurist understands most apocalyptic prophecy, especially end time material, as referring to events that are all in the future to the present reader. We all know people who read the book of Revelation that way. Everything in Revelation is yet to happen from that mindset. Prophetic symbols, therefore, are taken as describing concrete future realities, not necessarily things now. Whether we talk about literally or symbolically becomes less important here. What's important is they are yet to be fulfilled. We're waiting for them to be fulfilled. And so those people tend to still be waiting for the kingdom to come, believing it has not yet come, because when they talk about it, we're talking about future events. The preterist reads prophetic text as being primarily fulfilled in the near historical context of the prophet or the original audience. So this was written in Daniel's day, his immediate audience, the people that received his writing. All of these things are going to happen, and it's for them. That's where its value is. And understanding it needs to be understood in the time in which it was written. So emphasis is placed on, if we get to books like Revelation, to first century or earlier events as the reference of what the prophecy is talking about rather than some distant fulfillment. Now, there's obviously in the book of Revelation, there is a reason why we have people who are preterist. You open up that book and it says these things must shortly come to pass. Okay, this is written for that generation. It has its fulfillment in that generation, and that's the only thing it means. That's the general position of the preterist. And then there's the idealist. The idealist treats apocalyptic language as symbolic representations of recurring spiritual realities, such as conflict between good and evil, faithfulness under persecution, whenever persecution arises, which happens intermittently throughout all time. Divine sovereignty. Just because God has acted in this instance to do this thing doesn't mean that he's never going to act again, or that that writing doesn't refer to a potential future action. Yes, it does describe this behavior, and yes, it does have application there. God acted to remove Nebuchadnezzar from office and take his power away from him. God acted to restore. Has he ever acted again before or after Nebuchadnezzar to put people into places of power and to remove them from power? So it would argue that any symbolic language that you can apply to that scenario with Nebuchadnezzar, you can apply to any scenario in which God does a similar action. That's the idealist. It's not the idealist in the sense of I have this grand ideal, but the idealist in the sense of, look, it's an idea. It's a principle which can be applied to all appropriate places. You can't tie fulfillment to any specific historical event as an absolute, but it could be a historical event. Yes, this applies, but it could yet apply again at some future point if the similar circumstances present themselves again. If I had to put myself into one of these four categories, I'm closest to the idealist. However, I don't put myself strictly in that category. I'm kind of one of those enigma hybrid guys, which is when it all gets complicated because we've placed it into four clean, clear categories, but that's not the reality. The reality, there are probably thousands of different views about some of these things and people that debate very strongly to defend their position. However, if you boil down all the different positions, you can put them into one of these categories generally. And so that's why it's important to notate that. Other debated elements that are found in the book, such as the identity of the fourth kingdom. Okay, that's a debated element. We've already talked about who we believe historically it applied to in the context of the prophecy, which is moving toward the establishment of the kingdom in the days of these kings. This kingdom made without hands would come into being. We have a particular place in history that we place that and define that, but it hinges upon understanding the way in which time, times, and half a time is used, both in chapter 7 and chapter 12, because it's used twice in the book of Daniel. The willful king that we just studied about. Who is the willful king? Oh, there are people who believe it's a specific individual and it applies only to that one individual. That decision is based largely upon understanding what that phrase means and making application of that phrase accordingly. The abomination of desolation. We talked about that either last week or the week before last. That's another one. When you see the abomination of desolation, Jesus uses that language, right? In Matthew 24. Now, he has something specifically in mind, but the question then becomes, does that phrase only apply to that one incident, or could it apply to other incidents? And how does it apply as it's used in Daniel's prophecy, as it's used by the Lord in Matthew 24? Those are questions that become debated, because this phrase is kind of a fulcrum in which all of that time placement and identification is based. If this means this, then this has to be talking about this, because otherwise it doesn't fit. And so they define those other items based upon their understanding of this item. That's why it makes this one so important, and why it's worth what's going to end up being at least an entire class and maybe two to discuss. Scripture presents it to show that God's people will endure trials. I think that's pretty clear. These trials happen subordinate to his sovereign control and will end according to his plan. The exact duration, however, is not specified in the text and should therefore be understood as a symbolic expression. That's generally how it's never set in a way in which you can say, oh, well, this says that you're going to suffer, but you're going to suffer only for X number of days or X number of months or X number of years. That is not always the case with prophecy. Daniel read Jeremiah's prophecy and determined what? It was time for them to return from captivity. That's where this whole story starts in Daniel, is him reading that and going, hey, our persecution is over. This one, unlike the Jeremiah reference, doesn't give you the parameters in which you can say, oh, this is talking about exactly this long. The markers are all variables, to borrow from my algebra illustration earlier. So unless we can determine enough of those variables and lock them into where they are knowns, then it's impossible to define all of the variables. So as I talked about a moment ago, how many views are there? Well, there's a bunch, but they all fall into one of four general categories. Either a literal view, which is chronological in nature, and they usually define this as being 3.5 years. Anybody want to guess why they say 3.5 years? Time, times, and half a time. Time is 1 year. Times, therefore, is 2 years. Half a time is a half of a year, 3.5. You know what the problem with that is? Time is never defined. Do you believe the Bible is literally true is a common question that's asked. What is our common answer to that question? Yes, the Bible is literally true. Do we really believe that the Bible is literally true in every word? Not in an absolute use of the word literal, in a generic use of the word literal, which means that we actually have faith in this book that it's telling the truth, and that we should listen to it and it means what it purports to mean. But to borrow language from a friend of mine, Steve Fontenot, you might have heard many people say the Bible says what it means. Steve Fontenot's response to that is no, the Bible means what it means. Because it does use figurative language, and figurative language by definition is not literal. So if it says This many days, the question is that a literal time frame or a figurative time frame? And if I say it's a figurative time frame, then I'm not taking every single word as literal. I am generally taking the Bible as literally true, but that's where some of the problem comes in. When we talk about literalist in this sense, we're talking about people who say it means exactly what it says, who read the book of Revelation not as a book of symbols, but as a book of real descriptions. The beast is a beast. The number is a literal number. It is literally going to be on people's foreheads. Is that the way we understand all of the language of the Bible? No. Then you got the symbolic category, which is very theological. I'm influenced by this. We're going to study in the next hour a lesson that is built from the first week of reading this year in the reading list, which is the first 25 chapters of Genesis. Y'all hold on, we got 25 chapters to cover this morning in the sermon. Now, if I was to go through and cover 25 chapters through the paradigm of word by word, we'd be here for a long time, but I'm not. I'm going to look at it through the paradigm of what? The theological, the overall arcing points that are being made through these things. They tend to look at duration of this time times a half a time as indefinite but limited. That is very close to my understanding of it, though I would not say that I am purely theological in my understanding of Daniel, because I do think that there are some literal things to derive from it. I do think, especially when the text assigns them, when you look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream, for instance, about the statue, we know who the head of gold is. Why? Because that information is given. We also know who the silver section is and who the bronze section is. You know what we're never given? Who the iron and clay section represents. Now, I can make an argument that if the head is this, and the neck and shoulders is this, and the middle part of the body is this, what comes next? Well, historically, we know what comes next. And make the argument, therefore, that the legs and the feet of clay and iron must be Rome and what was left of Rome. But we're never given definite information about that in terms of that last image. But if you hold the theological view, then you would not apply it to anything in specific. And I would say I'm more of a hybrid. There's part of it that's literally applied to specific kingdoms and part of it that's more general, which brings up the third one, which is a hybrid category that says that it's symbolic, but has definite application. Then there's what's known as the extended category that historicizes it. That's the first group, the historicist that we talked about earlier. And they define this time times and half a time as centuries. So it gets us from this time of Daniel to the end. This is the flow of events. This is what we should be looking for to identify exactly what's going to happen next. The problem that you get into with making application like that is when you get into things like, okay, when is the end of all things? Well, if this is a historical description of when man's going to be judged, then we've got a roadmap for the end of all things. I would argue, however, we can't identify when the end of all things is, because that's not the way this works. And so it affects the way we understand the text and therefore the way we apply the text. If we look directly between the way it's used in chapter 7, and that clock is useless. I'm trying to watch the clock on my iPad because I think it's closer. Everybody got 9:37? Okay. Shared language exists between chapter 7 and chapter 12. That is an explicit internal link between this language. Daniel 7:25, Daniel 12:7, they share that same core phrase, a time, times, and half a time. It's not incidental repetition. It's intentional. It's the only distinctive time formula that's repeated verbatim across the visions of Daniel. The reuse tells us, therefore, that chapter 12 is in some way linked to chapter 7, that what chapter 7 is talking about is being revisited in chapter 12. Because whatever it means in chapter 7, it means in chapter 12. And if it applies to the events of chapter 7, then it applies to the events of chapter 12. Daniel 12 is not introducing a new period. Therefore, it is returning to a previously introduced period. And you'll find that they have shared subjects. If you look at Daniel chapter 7, for instance, verses 18, 21, and 25, you'll see that it's talking about the saints of the Most High. Remember that, saints. Because when you get into Daniel chapter 12, it talks about the power of the holy people. The holy people and the saints are one and the same subject. And both chapters deal with this general information. God's people, the saints of the Most High, are the holy people, are oppressed. Their opposition is temporary. And the period ends not by a human victory, but by divine decree. Those are the things in common between these chapters. And so we've been talking about coming up to this, that Daniel starts off by reading in Jeremiah and said, hey, it's time for us to go back. And God says, slow your roll a little bit, step back and realize that that doesn't mean that everything's done. There's yet something bigger going on out there, things that you don't know about, things that you don't see. And so, yes, that is part of the process. Going back is important. That's why I told you it was going to happen and told you when it was going to happen. But don't start thinking that's the end. You're still working for something. And don't think that just because this persecution is ending, that all persecution is ending for all time. Daniel 12 does not redefine the group. Therefore, it assumes continuity in the discussion. And I personally believe and would argue that that continuity is still enforced to this very day, despite the fact that time has passed and that orders have passed and that hierarchy has changed and that the kingdom made without hands that was prophesied about in Daniel has in fact appeared. And we're part of it. That there's still a continuity between the saints of the Most High today and then. The people of God. They weren't called Christians then. Why not? There was no Christ and there was no new covenant yet. Only in prophecy. But they were still faithful and righteous and godly and devout and followers of the Most High God. All terms that describe Christians as much as it described faithful Jews or the faithful patriarchs before them, before there was a law. And there's a continuity between people of all of those eras who believe God, put their faith in God, listen to the commands of God, and follow the Word of God. And what applied to them applies to us. And that's why when we read the story of Abraham, for instance, and we see the providential hand of God providing for Abraham, what can we extrapolate from that? If I have a faith like Abraham, what do I know? That I'm going to please God, and that God is acting providentially to care and provide for me and bring me into the things that have been promised me. Has he ever promised you or me to make a great nation out of us? In fact, Abraham got promised two great nations from him. His descendants became two great nations. I've never been promised that. I don't know what my four kids are going to turn out to be. I don't know what their children are going to turn out to be. I don't know what's going to happen down the line. We may be forgotten about in history. Abraham was guaranteed to never be forgotten about in history because two great nations arose from him. That was a promise. He's never made that promise to me, so I should not expect that God is providentially seeing that my descendants become a great nation. But you know what promise he has made to me? That he will care and protect me, that he will overcome my enemy, that he will raise me in the last day, that he will change me and bring me to be with him. He's promised me those things. And I could say, when you look at faithful Abraham, and we see that he did all the things that were necessary in order to fulfill the promises that he made to Abraham, to the point that Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham believed that if he killed his son, God would raise him from the dead to fulfill the promise, if that's what he needed to do. He was so certain that God was working to deliver on his promises to him. And we see that, yes, in fact, he was, and that he fulfilled every one of them as promised, that he is working to fulfill the promises that he made to us. And that being someone with a faith like Abraham's means something, even though I'm a Christian. And he was not. He couldn't be a Christian. He didn't even yet understand the idea of a Christ. But there is this continuity between the people who are the saints of the Most High, who are holy people, set apart as God's possession. Shared outcome, the end of oppression, not the end of history. There is a connection, Daniel 7:25. Oppression lasts until the time period ends. Daniel 12:7. The period ends when, this is a quote, the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end. When the persecution against the people stops, that's when the period of time stops. In both cases, that is what the phrase marks, a termination of persecution, not a termination of history. Now, at some point, will the termination of persecution be the termination of history? Yes. But it doesn't mean that it's that case there. It means that the termination point of the persecution happens. And that can happen many times. We're talking about the termination of the persecution, not the beginning of the persecution. There's a big difference between the onset and the end. But it's not necessarily the final judgment in the end of all persecution. It's simply the removal of the oppressive power. And again, eventually, all the enemies will be put down, and we're told what the last enemy is. What's the last enemy that's going to be destroyed? Death. When is death going to be destroyed? When is death going to be swallowed up in victory? Well, yeah, but let's not jump ahead. Let's talk about 1 Corinthians 15 for a moment. We're told specifically what act is going to signify death being put down and overcome. What's the subject of 1 Corinthians 15? The resurrection. When we are all raised, death is destroyed. Death is no more. Until that happens, this just means the end of the current oppression. The last oppression. This is when I know the end's going to come. I'm going to tell you, we can all know exactly when it is the end and when judgment is imminent. You know when it is? When everyone is called forth out of the grave. When that happens, then I know it is the end. Because I am told that the last enemy that is going to be defeated is death. This simply is talking about the current enemy being defeated. I'm out of time probably, huh? So yeah, I am. So let's pick this up next week. We're going to talk about Daniel 12, narrowing the focus of Daniel 7. Daniel 7 is a broader look at these things. Daniel 12 starts to narrow the focus down a little bit. And that's its purpose. That's its point. And so before we get into it, we want to talk about that so that as we're going through it, we see it. Appreciate everybody's attention and presence and the comments that we received. And hopefully this is going to prove valuable to you, especially as we go forward.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the